Hello, Global Theater. My name is Jerry Pielka. Today is September 20, 2023. Want to thank Rob Grant and his amazing podcast, I'm Probably Wrong About Everything. It's an honor and a pleasure to be here with Alex Miller for part 2. Alex, where in the heck are you calling in from?
I'm calling in from conference room 20 something at the MCLA campus in North Adams, Massachusetts.
North Adams. How cool is that?
Very.
So, the way it goes is we left off on question 11. Number 12 is James Joyce was the first projectionist in Dublin about 100 years ago. He basically checked out. He said, "This is stupid. Why should I go inside a building and see a movie of a tree when I can go outside and see a real tree?" Years later, Faulkner said sometimes the best fiction is more true than journalism. Why do we have to recreate things in order to get them? Why do we have to go to a theatrical play of people acting out life? Why don't we just live life?
Well, because it's all about portrayal and the way things are projected. I mean, granted, if you were in a movie theater and it was a projection of a tree as it is photorealistic and everything, that could be comparable to why don't I just go out and actually look at a tree, right? But everything that goes into depicting something can present a different layer of interpretation in the way you interact with the world around us. Even with the most primitive, whether it's the most primitive camera or the high def stuff that we have in our pockets nowadays, a projection of any object, whether it's a tree, a sock, or a building, is going to be different when it's reprojected. And the irony is that with Joyce back then is that the literal projection of whatever it is, maybe a tree or whatever, probably looked pretty amazing compared to the video and film technology that we have today. I mean, if you look at like the film and stuff that the Lumiere brothers shot on, it's infinitely more artful than you can get from a high def picture that you can get nowadays with the cameras that we have in our pockets with smartphones and everything. And I think that's one of the things that is really special about film is that, it's meant to capture light because film needs light like we need air to breathe. But with digital projection is that it leaves nothing to the imagination. Is that you can pull out your phone right now and you can get a, literal mind's eye version of the floor, that speck of dust that's right there. With film, you're not going to see, 20% of what's picked up digitally. And that's where I think the big difference is that it's the camera is not as good as the eye. And the eye now is as capable as the photography we have access to. And I think that's one of the things that makes depiction so important is that something so simple can bring up so many different other aspects.
Really good, Alex. It's good to be able to review. In 40 years of interviewing, I don't ever go back and listen to them. But now that I've rigmarolled myself into doing these part 2s over the last month or so, like the guy yesterday, he's a big Hollywood director. You should look him up. And he says, "Am I supposed to keep this down to 1 or 2 minutes? Because that's what my suggestions say."
Yeah.
And I goes, "Oh no, I'm sort of ignoring that rule now. I got to erase it because I want people to go on longer if they want, because I want to get even deeper." So then I start doing part 2s and I forget how many questions I asked out of order, and I don't want to repeat because like you can tell me, "Oh, you already asked me that last time," if you want, if I do that, or you could just say, "I know you already asked me that, but I'll just answer it again differently or the same." So in reviewing your part 1 today, I was astounded by that early memory of you seeing the sun go behind the cloud and how much impact that had on you as a kid. So that was like shifting light, right?
Yeah,
you were in the sun, and then all of a sudden this cloud covered the sun, and it had this emotional impact on you. Like
Nature
you didn't know
director.
Huh?
Nature was my first director.
Nature was your first director. And then you also stress this thing called tone. But my favorite was when you learn from your dad, dance even if you don't know how to.
Yeah.
That is those were like some real gems I got from that part one. But there's a McLuhan line that goes like this: everybody experiences far more than they understand, yet it is experience rather than understanding that influences behavior. Now, I'm going to tell you the way I interpret that. It could be wrong, what he meant. And then I wanted you to suss out what you think. Like if a child comes in from the cold and their hands are freezing, the parent can say, you can go up to the stove and rub your fingers and get your hands warm. I'm teaching you the dynamics of heat. That's called understanding. Or the parent can go, don't touch the stove, they'll burn your hand. So it is really experience that shapes our behavior when it should be more understanding. So how do you differentiate between those words in sort of this scenario, experience versus understanding?
So it's funny because there's a lot of times where we experience things that we don't quite understand until after the fact. And I've gone through life and I've caught myself, just for instance, the other day I misused the word nonplussed, and a friend of mine corrected me on it, and I was like, well, here we go at the stage in life. I'm still learning and stuff from experience, you know what I mean? And I think that's one of the things that happens is that you can be doing something wrong for years and years and years, and if no one's there to correct you or let you make a mistake to learn better, you could still have these minor revelatory moments. And I think that's amusing too, because there is that moment where, maybe reach for a stove, or you have a fork in your hand and you're near an outlet, and you kind of look to the first person you see, to say this look of recognition of, should I do that? Should I do it? Like there's a light going off in the back of my head, but it's not bright enough to guide me in the right direction. So if I could get a cue from someone, that'd be great. And sometimes that cue is nothing, and then you get shocked or you get burned, and you don't do that again. But it's funny. So I guess the thing is that I guess the response to that is that there's one or the other, but there's also the variable that we can experience things and not fully understand them, and maybe get something completely different out of it.
Yeah. That's like T.S. Eliot said, that I had the experience but missed the meaning. So yeah, and there's so much gray area there and resonating. Like like you gave a good example there. Well, Alex, you also in part one talked about how your mom rented Barry Lyndon because you were trying to tape it, and then you got Towering Inferno. What a great story. But where was it? Because they did raise you with a sense of this cinema as an art form in a way. It wasn't just, hey, that's entertainment, go be entertained so I don't have to babysit you. It seems they gave you some sort of nurturing of aesthetic growth on what is cinema. What's the tipping point when you go, oh, that's what I want to pursue, making films? Or since you're an artist and a writer, just being creative, when did you have that tipping point to, so that's my calling?
It's one of those things where I had been doing film criticism for a very long time as a kind of a freelance hobby and what have you. It's really hard to earn a living from film criticism or writing especially. And I had always been obviously enamored with film and with the moving image, but it always kind of seemed like a little too far off, like pipe dreamy almost, if you will. Like you had to
Yeah.
either know someone or have these resources, and that you know, you could either shoot digital or you could shoot film, either of which are really expensive and you need to collaborate. And it's it was a few years ago I saw Chris Marker's Sans Soleil, and the possibility of telling a story with stock, not stock imagery, but you could just film footage from around the world in a kind of a ethnographic curiosity, or even taking home movies or different footage. And I could almost sum up the four biggest influences are Sans Soleil, Chris Marker in general, the locus of all his work, alongside Craig Baldwin's Tribulation 99. And then adjacent to that would be Olivier Assayas's Irma Vep with Agnès Varda's Jacques de Nantes, where it's a very much a chronicle of her husband's career and upbringing. And there's a pivotal scene in that where he takes a strip of film, of a Charlie Chaplin film that he had in his hand crank projector, and he scrapes the emulsion off with a spoon or a butter knife or something like that. Then he paints these little images on him and makes this little not stop motion, but animated film. And at the time, like, that really blew my mind, because I was collecting Super 8 films at the time, like people's old home movies, and then recording them on my wall and then uploading them and then re-editing them and reshuffling them. And then I saw that part in the Agnès Varda film, Jacques de Nantes, and I was like, oh, I can scratch film. I can rewrite that. You know, it's not what's on the film. It's that I can just destroy the film and you know, create stuff by destroying it. And then this kind of led me down the rabbit hole of like stuff like Bill Morrison and Rodney Asher and Craig especially. And it was Rodney, actually, because I was collecting all these archival 16mm films, and there was this one about Alaska, and it was it had this, like, there's this moment where the narrator says, like, there are these strange military buildings up there, no one knows what they are. And then I started thinking, like, oh, wouldn't it be cool to put together this like kind of paranoid mockumentary about like military experiments and like subjugating indigenous people for like big oil and da 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 da. And I told this idea to Rodney, and he said, you should really check out Craig Baldwin. He's the greatest of all time when it comes to mixed media mockumentary stuff. And I did. And I watched Tribulation 99. I loved it. But then I was like, I can't make this Alaska movie. Craig already did it 30 years ago with Tribulation 99. Another paranoid mixed media pseudo footage documentary, you know.
Right.
But that's really what got me going, is that you can make movies that you can make
Right.
art on your own terms, outside of having these innumerable resources, or without studio assistance. I think it was Dennis Hopper who said, if you want to beat the studios, leave them in their studios. Is that you grab a camera, 16:8, whatever, and just shoot on the street. Maybe it was Godard or Hopper, or maybe it was Hopper talking about Godard. That was the sentiment, was leave the studio people in their studios and do your own thing.
Yeah, that's funny. You mean Dennis Hopper, right?
Yeah.
Because that's, you know, he had Bill, or he had Bruce Conner shooting some of Easy Rider.
Yeah,
which is, you know, pretty amazing. But the third one was Agnès Varda. Was that who you said?
Yeah, Agnès Varda.
What's the title again? Jacques Demy?
de Nantes, or Jacques of Nantes.
It's on Jacques Demy, her husband.
Yes, yeah.
It's a doc on him. That's good. Okay, so but you started with film criticism. Let's go back. What first said, well, I can do film criticism? Because you mentioned Ebert and Siskel and Ebert in this sensibility of film criticism. I mean, did you grow up reading film criticisms and say, oh, I can do that? Where's the tipping point where you decide to be a film critic before you were a filmmaker?
I think one of the tipping points was that when I was probably a teenager, I always loved the essays. When you buy like a Criterion DVD or Blu-ray or like a Kino, you get the essay in there, and that to me was the best of the best right there. And I was joking around, and I referenced him in our last interview. It was Josh, the guy who ran the record store in my hometown, and I was like, how do you get that job? How are you the guy that writes the synopsis, or the person who writes the essay, you know, how do you get that job? And he was like, well, you know, you have to have some visibility in the writing community, but a lot of people get started online now. Back then, writing.
Oh, you mean Josh? Josh sort of said, "Go online," and you did it.
A lot of people get that's a big way to. That's a huge opportunity in terms of getting a visibility. Because
and that's indeed what connected us, because I read your stuff. Yeah, so that's funny because you got on to meet Rodney before you met me, and I asked Bill Morrison all these questions once too, and he's the one in my book. He says, now I know why you asked for 90 minutes, because at 60 minutes, he says, I got to go teach at Cal Arts now. He says, now I know why you asked for 90. So, but I've been wanting to revisit Bill. He's very articulate, a filmmaker, and he's a great filmmaker. And, he got written up in the New York Times Sunday Magazine. I mean, no experimental filmmakers get written up in the New York Times Sunday Mag, but this is good, because now I talked to a screenwriting teacher years ago, and he said a great film is when you can clearly see the intention of the maker. Kubrick says the opposite. A great film is when you can clearly not see the intention of the maker. When you're making a film, an Alex film, what role does intention play in your creative process?
Intention plays an interesting part, because I remember one of the things I say is that whatever you intend to create, you will probably sabotage. Is that if I set out to make a Western, you might end up with a sci-fi tale. I set out to create a true to life, verite Wiseman-esque documentary, it'll probably turn into a horror film. So there's a lot of times where I'll set out to do something, and then circumstances uncontrollable, or what happens is that I'll record some footage, and my method of gathering footage is that I'll just throw my camera in my car, and I always say the coolest shit could happen the second I step outside of my house. Maybe a plane takes off, maybe there's a blimp accident, maybe there's a wildfire, I don't know. So I always like having my camera with me. And then I remember I drove by, and there's these guys in the fire department were burning this huge pile of brush, and I just pulled over and asked if I could film it, and they said yes. So then I had that footage, and I was like, well, the next film I'm going to make, I'm going to have to use there's going to have to be a scene with a lot of fire, because I have this great fire footage. So a lot of it's being written on the fly as I'm going along with it, and I'll have these kind of broad ideas of with my film like Burnt by the Sun. I wanted to make something scary, and I thought what scared me, well, I thought what scares me is an invasion of privacy, which is where the idea of having this rogue preacher going around and leering into windows and stuff was kind of like this kind of not like a folk tale here, like a folkloric villain.
Right.
So it's a very improvisational, unpredictable process. And I think it goes against all the principles of filmmaking of, I don't have storyboards or scripts really in place. Is that I find the footage that I like. And then if it coincides with the story I want to tell, that's where it kind of hits. That's where the magic happens, right? And then if I'm feeling more and more feisty or daring, I'll try to stage actual footage and film things as they are, and have that conform with the story I want to tell. But all the stuff in between is just as vital as the stuff that's in design, if you will.
Well, Duchamp said there's no art without an audience. How much are you thinking of your viewer, potential viewer, future viewer, when you're making your film?
Almost all the time, but I don't want to say like I'm oblivious as to whether or not they're going to like it, but like is such a funny thing, because I don't the art that I connect to the most is usually something very provocative, or dangerous or upsetting, or evokes these very deep emotions. And the best compliments I get from some of my work is that, like, someone will say like, oh, that was visually disorienting. It gave me a headache, or oh my God, I felt queasy after watching it. And it's not it sounds a little it sounds a little perverse to say, but I like that I can actually, without trying to, kind of get to someone on a subconscious level. It would be strange if somebody said, like, I had a great time watching your film, because I usually delve into the darker side of things. But
well, that's funny, because the cliche is, this bugged me for years. It still does. When someone gets up and introduces their film and they go, I hope you enjoy it. It's like, don't tell me how to feel about your film. Just say, I hope you feel something, and I hope you even fall asleep, or it's just such a cliche line that everybody says it. It's just, they don't mean it. They mean, I hope my film affects you or has an impact on you. But they say it like, oh, enjoy the show. And it's such like, anyways, it bugs me,
it's
because I do.
like the
Go ahead.
generic MC thing to say, of course.
Yeah,
Break a leg, enjoy the show. Like, ooh,
right.
very
And I said to this Hollywood director I interviewed a couple of days ago, I said, I think great art for me is when it fucks your shit up and it makes you go, oh, I could do that. So it's sort of like, you seeing these early influences of yours, like Sans Soleil, and go, I can do that. But it still sort of shifts you, like, well, why is it making me feel this? Why doesn't it coddle me and make me feel good? Like, I grew up with what's called feel good movies, like
Yeah.
Frank Capra. You're supposed to feel good.
Yeah. Oh, and it's funny too, because Capra is coined as the feel good guy, but there's still some pretty dark stuff in 34th Street. Guys, ready to kill himself to get the insurance, and
Of
there's
course.
yeah, right. It's Capra Americana, but it's still pretty dark. And a part of the when you said something that messes me up is I can't help but mention it, but I'm part of I started an independent study this semester tailored around the Claire Denis film Trouble Every Day, and there's a little bit of connection there with the Zappa, because that's a Frank Zappa song, and
Yeah.
then obviously you're very much a disciple of Frank Zappa and his music, and I had actually just come from a meeting just a few hours ago as a part of this independent study. And a huge part of it was the film is that it's a film that, does mess you up, and it provokes these very deep emotional responses, because it's a very transgressive movie. And it's one that has been, very much derided by critics, but is kind of receiving something of a renaissance in recent years. And just the connection there, I couldn't help but bring it up, and especially with film.
But that's just coincidence in wording, or does Claire know? Do you think Claire was aware of the song and was inspired by those two words together?
Claire Denis is funny because she's a very, very cagey in her responses. And
Is she?
Yeah, and I think she I'm purely speculating, but I'm sure she is well aware, but she would probably rather, eat her shoe than tell you.
What year did the film come out about?
2001.
Wow, that's amazing. I never knew about that. So that's good. So McLuhan says everything we invent extends some humanness. Knife and fork extends our teeth. The shutter in a camera projectors maybe an extension of our eyelid. Maybe even religion or philosophy, non-tangible, is an extension of consciousness. What does the moving image camera extend for you? What humanness?
It's amazing, because of the way a camera works, the way a film camera works, especially, is so close to the way our actually eyeball works. Our pupils dilate and contract with light exposure, and it's the same way a lens works. And it's funny, because occasionally someone will ask me, if we're watching a movie or a show, like, why is this scene so dark? How come I can't tell what's going on? I'm like, oh, because there's, this is day for night, or they actually shot in a dark room, so they had to use faster film. The exposure is going to be changed to capture the best image that it can. So I would say that it's an extension of our eye, of our vision, especially.
Yeah.
And something that we're always trying to capture is, you will see something and you'll say, like, I want to project that, and I want to see it the way I want other people to see it the way I'm seeing it. And then when you see it, after developing or after you digitally upload it or what have you, it's almost never the way you perceived it, but you're always kind of, for me anyway, I'm always kind of chasing that ideal of that idle vision that I had.
That was good, Alex. It's funny because McLuhan said cinema, films, movies extend our foot because we travel. That's more the viewing experience, which he also said there's no such thing as a good or a bad movie. It's a good or bad viewing experience. Mm-hmm. Now, being a film critic, how do you handle a statement like that?
I think it's great because I have the utmost respect for anyone that can make a movie, whether it's an experimental film or, whether it's Tommy Wiseau, Ed Wood, or Steven Spielberg. If you can marshal the resources and, gather a crew and direct actors and get it done and in a can and projected, I mean, takes such a great deal of work. Whether or not it's good, is another thing, but you have to respect that process. I mean, the stuff that I do is so far off from any conventional sense of filmmaking. I mean, I remember I got my partner and a friend of mine to act in one of my movies, and that was like the most I've dealt with in terms of collaborating with other people and making a movie before. So I think I've become a little more compassionate in judging other people's work over the years. But it is funny though, because if the experience is pleasant or unpleasant, it kind of depends on the viewer, and it depends on what's being viewed. But there's also a tendency towards, I mean, like sometimes you'll read film reviews and stuff like that where there's like, it's almost like this like an invasion of morals or something like that when they when people respond to certain films. And like I think Amy Taubin's review of Dawn of the Dead was something, so she was so offended by it that she didn't even finish the film. And wow. I just think it's amusing that, like, you would have the audacity to it wasn't Amy Taubin, I'm spacing on the critic's name, so don't quote me on that, but yeah. It was it's a very audacious thing to say or do, but there's something to be said.
Didn't finish the film to actually say I couldn't watch the whole, because I got to put aside, I had a test screening for George Romero of Dawn of the Dead.
Oh wow.
In Ann Arbor, Michigan, in our auditorium sat 400 people, and it was free. So like 500 people showed up, and we couldn't let any more people in. And I was literally pushing the door shut, and they were pulling their hands through the door and trying to get in. So it was like before we started, it was an enactment of the Dawn of the Dead.
You had to survive the masses of people trying to get into your safe space. That's awesome. Oh man,
that's funny. You brought up Amy Taubin too, because she is someone who usually doesn't so much write on mainstream films. She writes in Art Forum on art films, and has always been a great supporter of Pixel Vision. And so
I think I'm wrong though. I think I got the wrong name though. I think it might have been Janet Maslin.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, we can look it up, but it's that's fine. Peter Greenaway said that cinema is much too rich a medium to be left to storytellers. Are experimental filmmakers telling stories a different way or doing something completely different? I mean, it's sort of a stupid question, but it's sort of like Tony Conrad's The Flicker is just black and white frames flickering on and off for 15 minutes. It's not storytelling or narrative in a traditional sense. Me or you could watch it and have a story go through our head. So, you know, with Greenaway saying this, cinema's much too rich a medium to be left to storytellers. Your thoughts on that in realms of narrative in experimental filmmaking?
It's a great quote, because there are these movies that can convey so much meaning without saying a word. And I'm thinking recently was I watched Tony Scott's The Hunger, and within the first 10 minutes, you've got this radically experimental, expressive, art film, but it's a big budget movie with movie stars, with Catherine Deneuve, Susan Sarandon, and David Bowie, right? And they're in this, they're in this movie that's like, it looks like a music video for, it's like a Bauhaus music video pretty much. And
Wow.
I remember, and I just thought the way the cross processing and the framing and these kind of very woozy, greasy looking compositions, I'm watching like emulsion in action. And it's telling a story, but it's the language of film, literally, and that the way you can develop and project and edit these frames, whether or not they're at 8, 12, 16, or 24 frames a second, there is a language to film, and you can do that just technically, and not even just stylistically, but just technically on a technical level. And then it's a perfect thing for Peter Greenaway to say, because I mean, talk about someone that can, puts together these very painterly compositions. And I remember watching Prospero's books, and I can't tell you what the story is. I can tell you about these gorgeous moments of, thoroughbred dogs, jumping over puddles that are inside of buildings that are full of gorgeous people wearing ornate clothing. I can't remember a damn thing about the story, though. But that's not to this film's detriment. Exact opposite. That's why I love it. That's why I'm probably going to go home and watch it tonight.
Yeah. Yeah, no, Greenaway's an amazing filmmaker. He's very articulate about it too. It's good to see him talk. But Andrew Noren said, if you put one frame after another, that is linear narrative, whether it's abstract or not. So it's interesting, because sort of the traditional tropes for experimental film is defined in like Wikipedia are one person, not a crew, non-narrative, in these certain tropes. So if me and you were starting the Ann Arbor Film Festival over 60 years ago, should it be more inclusive or more exclusive? And I'll set it up. I asked Chick Strand, most in Ann Arbor, mostly you see is experimental, but there is animation, there is documentary, and it's varied over the 60 years. But Chick Strand was doing the same thing starting Canyon Cinema in San Francisco with Bruce Bailey. And she said, well, we were trying to recreate our 11-cent movie-going experience by showing a newsreel, a cartoon, and then an experimental film. And Brackage came along and says, well, don't show that other stuff, just show experimental film. So there, what are these services and disservices of being inclusive as opposed to exclusive? How would you have handled it 60 years ago? Would you have leaned more towards being inclusive or exclusive?
I would lean into being exclusive of whatever is accessible, I guess. And I mean accessible in that I would want to show things that you can't normally see, I guess. Is that if Blade Runner's playing up the road and has been running for, 8.5 years, then I'm not going to show Blade Runner, right? And that's nothing against Ridley Scott or anything, and I love Blade Runner. But I would want to cater towards the films and filmmakers that are, or visual artists, whatever you want to call them, that aren't getting profile, that aren't being seen, because it's just all the more it's all more special, especially at that time before, you know, you have the internet and you have this breadth of access, is that it's important to showcase something that, you know, whether or not is different in terms of style, but just in terms of accessibility, because
Right.
access is so limited, especially in film distribution.
Right. And that's good. And so really the hidden question, Alex, is what are the services and disservices of ghettoizing or marginalizing experimental films? Jackson Pollock was on the cover of Life magazine in 1949. Normal people could start forming an aesthetic on experimental painting. There was no Bruce Conner or Maya Dare in Life magazine covers. Generally, and this is bias, it's rich art kids, you know, entitled rich kids who develop an avant-garde aesthetic and dominate experimental film.
Yeah, it's the funny thing is that like when you watch like a Bergman film or a Tarkovsky film for the first time, when you watch Persona, I'm like, this is what like an art film is. Like I've seen a parody before, you know, with like, you know, shots of faces and, you know,
Yeah.
dissolves, and I'm like, okay, this is like the art house aesthetic, right? And then you see something like the early films of David Lynch, like, okay, this is like the prototypical experimental film, you know, it's freaky, it's low budget, you
Yeah.
know. But the funny thing though is that there there is this like kind of, again, there's a stereotype of your average, you know, college film, experimental film, and stuff like that. But you know, you can rival that by going so far outside of storytelling, and this is where I think like the Bill Morrisons come in, who, like I mentioned earlier, is such a huge influence to me. Is that you can tell a story with, you know, the flotsam and jetsam of film
Yeah.
histories. You can find decayed, broken, damaged, or exposed movie stock, and that itself can be art. Some of the most knockout images in some of my films is just repurposed footage that I've found on a, you know, yard sale or the garage of my, you know, neighbor's grandmother, right?
Yeah.
And that I think has got to be part of it, is that try to eschew recognition as much as you can.
Yeah.
Else we're doomed to repeat ourselves, I guess.
That's it. And I spoke with Michael Apted 40 years ago. I said, why do rock video editors feel so obliged to edit fast? Most people don't know. Abel Gance invented rapid montage in 1922 in France, and it really flourished in the 80s with MTV, to the point where Marty Scorsese says, I cut my films faster because of MTV.
Yeah.
So Michael Apted said, because we've learned to take in information faster. Can we literally learn to take in information faster, or are we just brainwashed to believe we can?
A little bit of both. Because if you were to show someone, I think, you know, between ages, if you took someone from the age of like 18 and 24 and you showed them, say, like early Scorsese or something like that, or like a primitive music video or something like that, they would just be sold pat. And then you could, because over the past 20 years, we've introduced YouTube, we've introduced, you know, bloggers, vloggers, TikToking, Instagram, and stuff like that. Our ability to digest media is so fast, and that I think that if I were to, you know, present somebody with one of my films, I could say like 20 years ago, they'd say like, even by experimental film level, this is nonsense. You're cutting all over the place, and you're just frantic and jangled and what have you. But I think that our ability to interpret visual art has changed so much in the past few years with the advent of streaming media,
Yeah.
and with accessibility of editing. You can edit in your pocket now. You know, I keep going back to that, but it's really hard not to, because
Yeah.
it's such a revelation.
But the real question, Alex, is it literally possible for humans to multitask?
Oh, without a doubt.
Yeah.
Because it's where all of our senses are working at the same time, and they're not always in the same direction. It's like, you know, whenever somebody makes a joke about jazz, like, oh, it's 5 people playing different songs at the same time, I'd make that argument that, you know, I'm smelling something completely different from what I'm seeing, and what I'm hearing has nothing to do with either.
That's good. And then how did you what informed your framing aesthetic? Like, just now we're in a certain aspect ratio, you know, and we're framed, you know, you're framed a little off to the side there, and I'm a little smaller. You know, everyone develops some sort of framing aesthetic. What informed your framing aesthetic, how you frame?
I think if it's funny because when I got into this room, I think I went from like 4 different chairs when I was sitting, because I was like, I don't like this angle, and I go over here. One of the big things that's informed it though is that I try to think of like formal rules around framing, and one of them is a rule of thirds, which is why I'm kind of off to the left right now, because it just works on a level, which on an aesthetic level, and also it provides room to edit. So if I'm frame left, or my left, I guess, isn't that I motion to my left, I won't motion to my left, I'll motion to my right, and then I'll cut to something entering frame left, because that's just, you create a fluidity that way. That would be the most thoughtful method of my framing, because the most of my editing and the most of my footage is so bombastic and random from all these different sources. But I think if I were to actually try to capture something as it is, I'll try to get it framed in a way that gets the most potential out of that item. If I were filming a profile, I might try to observe some kind of symmetry or something like that with a face or what have you. But with an object, I want to get the most visual currency out of that image. I want it to stand out as much as possible. So I think that's got a lot to do with it, is that there's different potentials to different things as you film them.
Yeah.
And you have to play with it until you think you're getting like the strongest visual language out of it.
Yeah, it's interesting because Bruce Bailey, when I asked him that question in Ann Arbor once, he said, I revert back to Jean Cocteau, who said we formed our framing aesthetic the way they put the knife and fork down on the dinner table. That's you know, which is funny because, you know, Robert Frank started shooting these photographs that were like framed like this, or Cassavetes, the way he frames sometimes is off. And you know, I think it goes along with this emphasis on Nina Menken's new film about brainwash, you know, the female gaze and the male gaze. And what it boils down to is the way mainly men framed paintings and then they framed photographs, because that's what we grew up on, is paintings and then photographs and then cinema on how to frame something. So, you know, it's very unusual when we get out of that traditional framing aesthetic. And, you know, John Berger got into that, the human gaze. You know, is there a difference? Like, you know, this woman, Alice Guy Blanchet, who was like a peer of Méliès, did she grow up with the female gaze? She's making films when you know, she's inventing narrative cinema 130 years ago. Was she framing the way she saw men frame paintings and photographs? You know, is there a difference in the male gaze and the female gaze?
Oh, definitely. And it's just one of those things, because the male gaze is so inherent, and I think that's why it's important to address, because everything is catered towards I think patriarchal heteronormative standards, is that
Yeah.
there's not much consideration for, you know, there wasn't, or there has not been as much consideration for anything outside of that mindset for so long. It just became this embedded norm, is that if you're going to record or photograph the female figure, it's going to be in a flattering way. Whether or not it's sexual or suggestive is another thing, but is that it's going to be looked at or lensed as like a thing of beauty.
Yeah.
And I think when you get into what I refer to as, I guess, gaze inversion, is that, I'll watch films directed by women and I'll try to see how, depending on their orientation, how they've been filmed men. I guess to go back to Trouble Every Day in the Claire Denis film, it stars Vincent Gallo, and is very flattering towards his physique, towards his bone structure, and to things like that. And I think that's something that I don't think that a straight presenting male director would actually have an appreciation for. And that's why it's so important to look at these things, is because there's a whole, there's a whole, I guess, other cinema that we haven't been talking about for a long time, and it's cinema that has been directed by women. I mean, it's been there. It just hasn't been. It's been underrepresented, and as we're making corrective strides. Maybe corrective isn't the word, but we've been progressing towards democratizing gender in film, which is a vitally important thing because every voice should be heard.
Hey, I agree. And I love in Agnes Varda's Gleaners and I, when she actually physically says, I grab the image with my hand and does that rear view mirror shot in the car.
Yeah.
It's really amazing. So, Jean-Luc Godard told Michael Moore at the Cannes Film Festival when he premiered Fahrenheit 9/11, this film is going to help Bush get elected. Now, it didn't help Bush get elected per se, but it galvanized pro-Bushers. With this slew of political documentaries we've had over recent years, do they more activate or more pacify?
The narrative there is so is compelling because, I mean, I have to give a shout out to Godard for being a little provocative shit stirrer. I always appreciate that. And the thing is that whether or not it's intentional, if you are spreading the message of something, if you are conveying what you consider to be a political or socially relevant point, it will almost always be hijacked and weaponized by the opposition. Whether it's propaganda, documentary, or something like that. I mean, if you look at Why We Fight is a response to Triumph of the Will, work of Rainer Riefenstahl. And this is something that also kind of goes down the line of then Rainer Riefenstahl goes on like a corrective action tour of these very kind of colonial ethnographic photography around Africa, but it's very staged and very telling of her collaboration with the Nazi Party. But what happens is that there is a tendency for these visual mediums to be weaponized by either side. Depending what side you're on or who you agree with, I guess is irrelevant. But I guess the term weaponized is evoked in that if it doesn't align with your belief system, then I guess it's weaponized because you perceive it to be dangerous. But if it's from your side of the fence, it's for the positive. So it's an interesting way to go because so much of it depends on where you fall on the political spectrum. Myself, as obviously more liberal, I'm more on the side of I'm more on the side of Michael Moore, but obviously Godard also, I mean, he did kind of a point there too, though, is that when you put this stuff out there, it can be it's not just going to be interpreted, but it's going to be repurposed and re-identified in so many different ways.
Yeah, it's like Battle of Algiers is the ultimate because Bush's cronies used it as a training film, and the Black Panthers use it as a training film. Mm-hmm. And they ask Gilo, "What does your film do?" And he goes, "I don't know, teach people how to make films." He didn't even take because it is a fake documentary, and there's only one person in it that's an actor. And it's really an amazing film because it's listed as a fiction film when it's really nonfiction. And then, I had trouble with Fog of War because it's an important film. It's a great film, but in my opinion, it humanized a war criminal.
Mm-hmm.
And my wife's dad is a real political activist, and he said humanizing anyone is good. But I've always wanted to ask Errol Morris about that. You're giving them a chance to be human. And that goes to, do these films more activate or pacify people? Cindy Sheehan, the great political anti-war activist, she said, we're talking to the choir and there isn't even a choir. So it's like, I sort of had a lecture once how Sheila Nevins hijacked the revolution because she just puts all these films on HBO, or PBS puts, Weather Underground on PBS, and then, rich white yuppies watching go, that I agree with that, and then they don't do anything, So it really goes more to your era is kids. I mean, I grew up watching Saturday Night Live and we would laugh at the news. But in your era, it seems that more people watch Colbert and Jon Stewart in what's called satire news, and that's how they get their news. So does satire news more activate or more pacify people? Same question.
I think it activates an awareness and pacifies by catering towards a sense of completion. Is that it'll activate a curiosity in the events, and it'll activate a response, and it'll activate someone to say like, oh, I'm so glad they mentioned that because I don't agree either. I think that's bullshit, whatever some crooked politician said. But then that spark kind of dies out because, like you said, it's that you acknowledge it and then just kind of move on. And I think that's I think it's got something to do with I guess to reference what we mentioned earlier with our ability to process information on such a higher rate, is that I think shows like John Oliver, The Colbert Report, The Daily Show are kind of doing even though with good intention, they're kind of doing what the 24-hour news cycle did with news, is that it's something like The Daily Show was kind of novel at first because it was like the very name is a play on words of what the news is, right? The Daily Show, and that's amusing. But I think that it might have something of a negative effect because it can lead to the proliferation of I don't want to say laziness, but I think complacency, in that they recognize something as being done but aren't doing anything about it.
It's well put, Alex, because it goes to the New Atlantis magazine article that recently came out. It's really thorough, explaining how Jon Stewart spawned Tucker Carlson. And it's basically not consciously, and maybe he doesn't have control, but we had the news and it was investigative journalism and they had so much budget. Once it got to the Jon Stewart realm, the budget increased by millions. And so then it was like, now we turn it into more entertainment than it is, educational or informative investigative journalism. Now, I was a freak for 60 Minutes for 30 years, but it's basically vaudeville. It's the money shot. They try to get to cry. It's Herzog's whole thing on, ecstatic, cinema with, Michael Moore is physical. It makes you belly laugh. In Ken Burns is emotional. It makes you cry. But, back to this satire thing, I asked my friend who wrote for Robin Williams, can satire be destructive? And he says, that's the job of satire. But if me and you do a cartoon in a certain country and they kill us, some people think dying is destructive. Swift compared satire to a mirror in which people could see every face but their own. And Frank Zappa saying, watch the Nazis run your town. Now go home and check yourself. You think we're singing about someone else. So the basic question is, can satire be destructive, or what is the function of satire?
There's such a satire is it opens up a wide conversation, and it's interesting because I was thinking too, if one funny aside, I guess, is that if think about the Daily Show before and after South Park. The Daily Show initially was just a weird comedic, riff on it. Didn't really mean anything. They did like silly 10 questions and stuff like that back when it was Craig Kilborn. And then South Park blew up and Comedy Central had a lot of money. And then the format for the show changed drastically. But I think one of the things with satire and it being destructive is that take something like the ultimate satire, I'll say one of the ultimate satires is Dr. Strangelove. And the satire on so much. It's a satire on, the arms race, the Cold War, and all these other things. And it's also a satire and a parody of the, atomic age movies. And for the longest time, I thought Failsafe was like a bad movie because that's like that's what Strangelove is making a mockery of. And then I find out Failsafe is actually a great film. And for years, I just avoided it because I just thought, like, well, if Kubrick's going to tear it apart, and if it's going to be the jumping off point for this great satire, I'm not going to watch it. It could be the same thing with the airplane movies, is that I went back and I watched the airport films. They're not great by any stretch of the imagination. They're fun to watch, but it's interesting because you don't want something to discredit what's being parodied or what's being satirized. Now, sometimes, with political satire is very different, is that, you're not satirizing or parodying another film, but something much more important, much more political. And, it can turn people on to different events and what have you. But it can also, I think it can, create a little bit of a disconnect between different events. Like there's a very amusing film called The Four Lions about these, very bumbling Islamic fundamentalists. And on the surface, it's very funny, but something like that is it can, I don't want to say trivialize because that makes me sound like a fuddy-duddy, but it can trivialize, I think, important issues.
What you said was, just to clarify this and expand on it, don't discredit what it is you're satirizing. Yeah, that's very interesting because there's a line that goes, you create what you resist. Bob Goldthwait, the comedian, morphed it into, you are what you hate. And James Joyce said, it's a curious thing how your mind is super saturated with the religion in which you say you disbelieve. Mm-hmm. And Louis Buñuel said, thank God I'm an atheist. So it reminds me of back to Zappa saying, or my friends has a theory that Frank satirized what he loved the most. He loved black music and he satirized it. So he wasn't discrediting it, but it could be people that think, oh no, he's making fun of it. He blackfaced himself on the cover of Joe's Garage. You couldn't get away with that nowadays. Oh, yeah. And so he was satirizing, Amos and Andy. That was his,
right.
I was in
the racist depiction of of persons of color.
Right. The whole album Thingfish, I was in Frank's bedroom once and getting something, and there was a VHS cassette of Amos and Andy next to his bed. Right. If you ever listen to Thingfish, it's amazing. But what do you think of this? Is it similar? Don't discredit what is being satirized. Is it similar to you create what you resist? Is that what you're saying?
In certain ways, like I think there's a lot of ways to go about this because like a real interesting thing is that the group Swans, Michael Girard. Yeah. And for years, I was always like, their music is obviously huge, literally and figuratively. And their album covers, I always thought were just so striking and so memorable and so bold. And it turns out that Michael Girard read the book. It's called, I think, The Patterns of Fascism. And it was the way that fascist parties used certain striking images in order to, to capture the attention of the masses, and that relates to the idea of circles with emblems inside them. And what I'm referring to is the swastika. And then if you look at Swan's albums, it's the same iconography. Is you have this bold striking circle and this certain font. And that doesn't mean he's flattering the Nazi Party or anything like that, but just finding there's something valuable in these kind of disreputable means of expression. I mean, that's a very slippery slope, but I mean, especially bringing up the Nazi Party. What am I thinking? But but it's an interesting territory to go into, and I think that there's a lot to be said for recognizing something, as well as understanding that there's power and there's something to glean from these different areas of media and then these different areas of filmmaking. There's
like in the long run, it's almost like Alan Watts. If you acknowledge your enemy, you empower them. If you satirize something, it's almost like you're trying to take it down. You're mocking it. Like I couldn't take Alex Baldwin mocking Trump every week on Saturday Night Live. I was like, what are you doing? This is horrible.
Right.
But is it help take him down, or does it hoik him up even more powerfully?
Right. Or is it just a paycheck for Alec Baldwin? I'll say one, two, a little bit of each.
Yeah, it is. It's like this causality. What causes things? You can't nail it, but we can study patterns.
Yeah,
and see.
Exactly. Well, and also there's this thing where when Adam McKay's Vice came out, I watched it and I remember thinking, is this satire or is it historical cosplay?
Yeah.
Because you have, we got someone that looks like Condoleezza Rice. Oh, that person looks like Dick Cheney. And that's all good and well, but what are you trying to say? Are you trying to tell us that Dick Cheney was a bad dude? Yeah, no, I think I have that figured out. But if that's your trip, that's cool too. But I think there's a limiting in perspective when you try to recreate things so accurately that you're kind of losing sight of what you're getting after.
Yeah, it even goes to the black photographer who was hired by the CIA to infiltrate the Black Panthers. And so he was literally getting his photographs of the Panthers out to culture, newspapers, and helping the Panthers be portrayed with great photographs. And on the side, he was getting kickback from the CIA.
Yeah.
In my opinion, all the power to you, dude. You could say you're a turncoat, but you were getting paid by the man to help your movement. So, they might not like me saying that, but indeed it's hard to gauge deep down inside what is causing what.
Yeah, there's a very powerful documentary that I just recently rewatched as a function of one of the classes I'm in, and it was Ava DuVernay's The 13th, which is
I know that. Yeah.
Which is a powerful film, and all the more just as important now as it was when it came out. I'd say even more so. And Angela Davis is saying, the Panthers were like, they had CIA, FBI, like every other member was an undercover agent, and and it was just a testament to just how terrified the establishment is by people organizing their community and trying to enact change and resist oppression. But like you said, though, is that again, all these pictures and all these iconic signs are the product of somebody sent in to bring them down, when in fact the flip side of it is that it probably ended up helping out because of the accidental PR of it, if you will, if you want to call it that.
Yeah. Accidental PR. That sounds good. That sounds like a good hardcore punk band.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. The A is an anarchy symbol, right?
So, Alex, this is fun. What's your hunch or guess? What was the motive of the cave artist?
The motive of the cave artist is that I think inherently we have this need to express ourselves, and I think the cave artist that painted stuff on the walls was probably a sibling to the cave artist that was banging rocks together, and I think was also a sibling to the cave artist that was, grabbing berries and mashing them together to eat. So I think of the senses that we engage most in artistically, visually and auditory and audio, whatever, you know what I mean, is that if I was raised in a cave and what have you, I'd probably still be drawing images in the sand or painting on the walls or something like that. Whereas you could take someone like my brother, who's a musician, he'd be the one banging on the walls with rocks and sticks and stuff like that. So
Right.
I think there's just this inherent need to express something visually or otherwise, because we're just very hungry. We're a very hungry species for all things, and one of those things I think is visual art.
Yeah. What's more important, conviction or compromise?
Conviction can get you a lot, but I find myself making more compromises as I get older. I think conviction is, yeah, conviction can motivate and inspire, but compromise can be just as productive. I guess it depends on the circumstances, but
Yeah.
yeah, that's a tricky one though.
And in your accomplishments, how do you rate these three elements? Luck, skill, and ambition. What's played the biggest role, second and third?
Ooh, um, so much of what I do is luck inspired. Is like, I think I mentioned before, but just so many happy accidents. Um, and I would say that it's a tie between luck and inspiration. And then,
Yeah,
yeah, luck and inspiration are tied for the top spot there.
that's good. I used to ask the question, and I'll ask it to you now. Is ambition based more on fear or joy? Your observations of humans in general. Is ambition based more on fear or joy?
Ambition, I think the most ambitious artists are the most gleeful ones. But on the flip side of that, though, I think ambition, you can be so closely, I think, associated with success, is that you can't be successful if you're not ambitious. And I think on an artistic level, financial success isn't always, the grand equator. So I think at the end of the day, it's I think it's more of a fear. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, that's funny because I asked the question for years. 80% of people would say fear. Then I read Friedkin's, before he died a couple of years ago, he came out with a book, or he was talking, very articulate filmmaker. He says, in Hollywood, skill and luck have nothing to do with it. It's all ambition. So then I changed the question to, is it luck, skill, or ambition? And some people change the word. No, they go, no, it's persistence or perseverance or, a necessity. So T.S. Eliot said poetry is outing your inner dialogue. What language is your inner dialogue in?
My inner dialogue is language salad. It's a mishmash of everything. For instance, if I'm watching something and it says, directed by Steven Spielberg, I'll say like, Deck Tired by Spellbrig 7. If it's produced by Chris Carter, I'll say Deck Sepper, Crass Critter. And I think that's got that's I think the joyful Alex brain, and that's how it works. And it's it's much more, I think, exciting because life disjointed is much more enjoyable than life put together. And I guess you could say that my inner language is word salad or Alexaranto.
I love it. Yeah, but I got to tell you, Abigail Child, a great experimental filmmaker in New York. I says, "What language is your inner dialogue in?" And she goes, "I wish I knew." Isn't that a great? So George Manupelli said, "Ignore yourself." Jonas Mekas mantra is, "There is no self-expression." The great jazz pianist Cecil Taylor says, "I'm just a vehicle and this stuff just comes through me." Is art making more self-expression or more you're a vehicle for whatever technologies, cultures, and environments are dominant?
I think the what comes through me is, I think, a huge part, because I can't explain a lot of my creative decisions. I can't tell you for the life of me why I decided to overlap certain frames the way I did, or why I thought that this melting, head was neat to looking to me, or what have you. And it brings me back to this saying that Curtis Harrington said, is that, like, with this proclivity towards horror, he's like, I can't tell you why I love this stuff. I just do. Or like when Orson Welles said, why filmmaking? And he said that'd be like asking somebody, why were you married so long? It's like, well, because I was in love.
Yeah.
And I think that so much of self-expression is this kind of involuntary response to your surroundings, or what your experiences are. And then I think what happens that you decode them in reverse, that you go back and you say, oh, I think I did that because I was feeling this certain emotion at this time, without really realizing it. Which I guess brings us back to one of your earlier questions, is that the way experience shapes us, and the way we make decisions based on what we've done, what we learned.
Yeah. It's funny you brought up Curtis Harrington, because he's a real hero. And he shot a film down the street where we put on events and show films in front of Beyond Baroque and Spark. And it's the old Venice City Hall and the old Venice Jail.
Oh, wow.
And in the last shot in Night Tide, Dennis Hopper's first. Have you seen that, Night Tide?
One of my favorite films of all time.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, the last shot, and it's really amazing because it is an experimental film in the Hollywood genre. It's not, it is truly. And so Dennis Hopper's coming out of Spark, which is a mural art center now, but it's the old Venice Jail. And in the background, you see Beyond Baroque, which is Venice City Hall, just a building in the background, barely. And he superimposes an Edgar Allan Poe film over the screen, like presaging that 60 years from now, that's going to be the oldest poetry center in the world. It's cool. It's so cool. I hope you come to Venice someday and I'll show you, because we had a Curtis show his film at our venue once, and he spoke. And really great filmmaker. So can art making be egoless?
Ego is such a tricky word, and it's hard because there's the ego and the self, and can you do it without the ego? And I think that it's the connotation of ego, I think, is what trips me up a little bit on this one, because it's so often associated with the negative connotation. Whether or not you can do art without an identifying qualifier, without something that says like, hey, this is a Alex movie or something like that. If I do make something like that, it'll probably be my worst movie. But if I do, is that if I do, you know, manage to make more stuff, which I, you know, I'm always yearning to do, I think it will have some authorial stamp. I hope that it's not a negative representation of myself in any way, I guess.
Yeah. It's funny because someone said, "Do you mean ego in as a bad way?" Because you know, one person told me a year ago, she goes, "Great art is egoless." And then another person said, "Great art has to be egoless." But it is, you set it up well. It's how we define what the word ego means. You know, and then I usually jokingly follow it up with, "Was Freud right?"
Freud,
And people,
the
go ahead.
I think the only time Freud was I think the thing with Freud is that he was close to right on a lot of stuff. The only thing that we got that he or we got wrong was the finality of his comments. Is that there's never anything that rock solid in psychoanalysis. I feel there's always so much more gray area.
Yeah.
But he was almost right about a lot of stuff, I'll say.
Yeah. Well, McLuhan probed Finnegan's Wake by James Joyce, saying that artists dream awake. Everybody can create these scenarios in the night, and artists can also do that while they're awake. Have dreams played a role in your creative process?
Oh, definitely. There's the possibility of dreams is a great thing to draw from. And what I think is interesting though is that you could films engage with dreams a lot, and I think the only one of the few filmmakers that have actually, I think, explored it was Kurosawa with his film Dreams, obviously.
Yeah.
And you have these other movies that, you know, maybe it's Inception or maybe it's, you know, What Dreams May Come, the Robin Williams film. And I think that they have these aspirations to portray this boundless feeling in filmic art, but I think that they're still bound by these rules that they're adhering to. Whereas Kurosawa just said, "I'm just going to fucking make it as I see it." And I think in my own work is that what I channel is that the emotion that's guiding the dream is that you can have these very, you know, exciting dreams, you can have these very, you know, intense, giggly dreams, humorous dreams, or you can have these very anxiety-induced dreams. And I think that's what I want to reproduce because I don't know if there's really a way to properly articulate. Like if I have a hard time, I think portraying the way I see things in the waking life, I think it's going to be more difficult to portray my somnambulant, my sleeping life. But I think if I can channel the emotion that I'm feeling in those dreamscapes, then I think that's something to really latch onto, because
Yeah.
it's shorn of everything else. Is that you have this guiding facet that's moving you along unconsciously, and I think that's what I want to do. That
It's really good. Lewis Carroll says, "I believe as many as 6 impossible things before breakfast." Have you believed in any impossible things lately?
Oh, all the time. I'm always rooting for the impossible, and I always think I I always think that there's some way to, you know, defy gravity, or I always think there's, you know, there has to be some way to transcend the plateau of what we perceive as normal, because it's so much more fun that way. I think I think one thing that recently is that I figured out a way to defy gravity in one of my films, is that I adopted what I think was used in Kubrick's 2001, is I used double-sided tape on a translucent piece of glass and rotated it above the camera to simulate this idea of weightlessness.
Yeah.
And you know, it's a fun lead-in to be like, hey, check it out, I defy gravity, you know, and you see this floating pencil floating around, and then what looks like, you know, the midair. So yeah, definitely.
Cool. Tell me one major element of your creativity that stayed the same and one major element that's changed in the years you've been being creative?
I think one creative element that stayed the same is my penchant for, I think this penchant for, dark, mysterious, and I think scary imagery is that it's something that that's something that I just find myself wandering into so much. And it can date back to, seeing The Shining at such an early age and developing this fixation and this fascination with horror films and horror cinema at such a young age, and continuing that more and more. But I think lately, um, I've been kind of fixated on this idea of just kind of creating something incredibly beautiful, something almost like obnoxiously beautiful. I was, excuse me, watching some Kenneth Anger shorts, and it was this film that he made in Europe, Edu Artifice, I believe. And it's basically just this very ornately dressed woman walking around these fountains with this classical music playing, and it's this completely transcendental, this transfixing moment, the cinematic moment, and it's a filmic moment too, because this is something that you can't make without film. It's impossible, just on the grounds that film is this it's something that you just can't replicate or replace, and that's something that I set out different. Is something I hope to achieve differently down the road.
Moshe Feldenkrais works with healing and movement. He says it's literally possible to identify a weakness and incorporate it to become a strength, rather than we're normally taught to overcome a weakness. Tell me a weakness you turned into a strength.
A weakness that I turned into a strength was, I think that for a long time I was offended very easily. Is that if I saw something or heard something that I didn't like, I would, rise up in this, righteous indignation. And then I think it might be my experience in the hospitality business that might have changed that. Is that instead of if somebody's difficult or someone is being rude or disrespectful, I will kind of flip the script in that I will not kill them with kindness, but I think disarm them with I think a mixture of, like, I guess, subversive compassion, where I will kind of I'll kind of flip the script, and I think that what a lot of people do when they're being malicious is that it's an idea of it's a symptom of control, is that they like having control, whether or not it's a control in a social interaction or a personal interaction. And I kind of like to disarm the idea that maybe control isn't really all that appealing, right? Is that maybe that's not the bag, and that it's we can all just maybe chill the fuck out.
Chill the fuck out. That was great, because the word subversive compassion really hit me, because it reminded me, if you don't have this book, I hope you get it. Film as a Subversive Art by Amos Vogel.
Yeah,
you have that.
I don't have it, but I know of it. Yeah,
dude, I'll buy you a copy. It is the most must book for you.
Hell
and
yeah.
Then the film that my friend made, it's an hour-long doc on Amos Vogel. You can watch it free on YouTube.
Oh, awesome.
Yeah.
Excellent.
Yeah. The guy is a great filmmaker, made a 8-hour film on Medium Cool.
Oh, awesome. Haskell Wexler. Yeah, that's right.
8-hour documentary by one person, free.
That's awesome.
Paul Cronin. Look up Paul Cronin, Cronin. He did the interview book with Herzog. He's really a great film guy. And so how do you find peace of mind?
It's peace of mind is interesting because it's I think it's something that I seek more than I would like. I'm not a very meditative person. I'm not, while I would think I'm a very chill type, I'm not a sit down, close my eyes type. I'm a very active person, whether, when it comes to the imagination or not. But what I think achieve in trying to what I but I try to achieve some kind of a sense of enlightenment, I think is done through peace of mind, because there is a slightly quantitative aspect to it. And then I think it also kind of puts the mind at ease in some ways, is that you gain peace of mind, and then whatever that peace was is kind of quashed in a way, in a positive way.
Yeah. So 5 quick Alan Watts questions off the top of your head in just a couple words. 1, who started it all?
A couple people.
Are we going to make it?
I sure as hell hope so.
Where do we put it?
Wherever it fits.
Who's cleaning it up?
We all end up cleaning it up in the end.
5, is it serious?
Always.
Good laugh after that answer. Couple more and we're out of here, Alex. It's been fun.
Cool.
If you were walking down the street today and you met yourself as a 12-year-old, what would you say to your 12-year-old self?
Relax. With a capital R. Relax.
Which way should toilet paper come off the roll, over or under?
Over. Always over. Never, never, ever. Because if the wind blows the wrong way, you got a pile on the ground.
If a publisher was to release your autobiography off the top of your head, what would the title be?
Winging It, the Skylab approach to living.
They want to scent the glue in the binding. What smell?
Orange cream.
If a statue was built in your honor, where would you want it displayed, and what would it be made of?
Ooh, I would want it to be displayed at the record store in my hometown, and I would want it to be made out of repurposed, outdated pieces of media.
Nice. I like that. Tell me something good you never had and you never want.
Something good that I have, but
no, something good you never had, but you never wanted. It's good you never had it, but you never want it.
I would say, that's a hard one. The ability to play the banjo.
It's good you never had it and you never want it. That's good. You know the 3 answers I get the most?
What's that?
Fame, money, and heroin.
Oh, you've got a good variable now with
playing the banjo. If you were in a vat of vomit up to your neck and someone threw a bag of shit at your face, what would you do?
I would ask them whose shit and what they had for dinner.
Never had that answer. Thank you. I love it when I get new answers. You know, I got to tell you this one answer I love. It was on the Venice boardwalk, and it was a young lady, and she said, I'd take the velocity of the bag of shit and I'd use it to swoop my way out of the vat of vomit.
There you go.
I said, that's the Descent into the Maelstrom by Edgar Allan Poe. You know, where you take, and it's what McLuhan says about sensory overload. We're swirling in this sensory overload. Why can't we use it to swoop our way out of drowning? You know?
Yeah, exactly.
I mean, that's sort of what you do. You find old films and, you know, do the Duchamp, and the artists of the future will only have to point.
Yeah, right.
What's the cultural shift you see developing today that inspires you?
I see this cultural shift, and it is a tendency towards, I think, it's a much more unifying tendency, is that I think I see people working together more and more lately, and people are so much more supportive than they ever used to be. I mean,
Yeah.
I'm going to a liberal arts college at 36 years old. You know, I'm practically the same age as a lot of my instructors and professors, and you know, I was very self-conscious about that. And you know, the student body has been just like so supportive and so nurturing, and it's just like night and day from when I was in school or when I was in public school. Is that, you know, I don't see anyone getting bullied. I don't see anyone being ridiculed. You're not laughed at for saying the wrong answer in class, and that's like it's so novel to me, and it is very inspirational because I see that's such a change for the positive, because it was so different, you know, a few years ago. You know, for me, it's you know, such a long time ago, but in the grand scheme of things, it's not that long ago.
Yeah.
And that's something that's really inspirational, I think, and much more is going to be a big signals of very positive change for the future.
Dude, that was beautiful. I'm glad to hear that. So what's the question? What's one question that remains unresolved for you?
One question that remains unresolved for me is the I think it's just the transience of time. That's
Yeah.
something that I am so much more enamored with more and more lately. Is that it's inescapable and it's a construct, but it's also very real. You know, you can fly from one time zone to the other. Did you just travel in time? I mean, technically, I guess so, but what does it really mean? And I think that's it's just it's something that's it's hard to wrap my head around to this day. Is that I'm looking at the clock right now and I'm like, it's almost 8 o'clock. I'm like, what does that actually mean?
Well, it's funny because early on, you mentioned Sans Soleil by Chris Marker. And, you know, Marker said, I abandoned Gutenberg for McLuhan a long time ago. And he said, after I became the ultimate Sans Soleil freak, I thought this is the greatest film I've ever seen. Then I started studying Marker a little and realizing, you know, you can read the whole narration for Sans Soleil online. It's pretty amazing what he wrote. But there's one line he basically asks, can we escape time?
Right.
And
Right.
you know, when you hear that piece of music or watch that piece of film or have an experience where time goes away, it is an amazing experience.
Yeah,
You know,
there's that the opening line is that I think of these kids that are, you know, these four children in Iceland, right? And then
yeah,
I would attach it to a long piece of black leader. And if they don't
yeah.
see the happiness, at least they see the black. And that knocks me out every time. It's the first
Oh, it's amazing.
minute of the film, and it's like just takes the rug out from underneath my feet.
Totally. It's on YouTube. It's just watch the first minute. You know,
Yeah,
that's all. Yeah, it's amazing. So, how has making films shaped your behavior?
It's shaped my behavior because in a way that um, it shaped my behavior because it's one of the things I never thought I'd actually be able to do. I never thought I'd actually be able to have the resources to, you know, make a narrative piece of visual storytelling. And I think that it's it's given me this kind of feeling of I want to do more now, and it's been very motivational. But I think it's also it is kind of like realizing a dream in a way. Is that, you know, I've always had these aspirations to be a visual artist or to be a filmmaker or whatever you want to call it, and actually achieving that is so novel. I almost have a hard time, you know, wrapping my head around it now, when, you know, just hearing that somebody call me a filmmaker is like, whoa, you know, it's this very, very
Yeah,
novel moment. And yeah, it's been quite a journey, and it's gonna continue to be a journey um, as I go.
super. Super, Alex. Two more and we're out of here. So Thornton Wilder said in 1928, art is confession. Art is the secret told. But art is not only the desire to tell one's secret, It's the desire to tell it and hide it at the same time. You've laid your cards out on the table for hours. I'm not insinuating you haven't already answered this. What's it really all about for you?
There is, one of the hardest things is like putting yourself out there. Is there's so many different times I've made something and then it's just hidden in my unlisted pile of like YouTube videos and stuff like that. And putting yourself out there and sharing whatever it is you have to say is one of the hardest things. But I think the other thing too, though, is that there are these moments of brutal honesty in some of my work, and there's these moments of just complete, whimsy, or not whimsy, but there's complete fabrications. In that, upon seeing other people interact with my stuff, some of them might take home the complete fabrications, and some of them might take home the realities as fabrications, and some of them take the fabrications as reality. And I think it's a fascinating way to kind of cultivate this strange aura around your own personality. And it's a fascinating process that I kind of happened across accidentally, but I hope to explore more down the road.
Yeah, it's funny because in 33 years of the Pixel Fest, I actually had a comment that evokes what you just said. Someone came up and says, "Oh, I get it. You're using a kid's toy." So all artists try to get to that child innocence in their making of art, not overthink it, let it naturally happen. And if you make it like a kid would make it, then it might come off profound. If you try to make it profound with the kid's camera, it's not likely to happen. So it's sort of funny. I always say you cheat. You start with a kid's tool, and then you might tap into the kid's innocence,
Right.
What gives you the most optimism?
The most optimism, I think, arrives in that moment of I'll get these moments of like blind reassurance when, if I make something and then somebody close to me says like, "Oh, that's brilliant, that's great," and I'll say, "Well, that's nice of you, but you're a feeling of me feels like there's something like, oh, they're just being supportive, or they're just being nice." When your mother or something says like, "Oh, nice job," it's like, "Oh, that's nice," but you have to say that. When you have just out of the blue someone just kind of come up to you and say, "This was brilliant," or "I've really enjoyed this," or I thought that you put this together quite well. That's the big moment, because these people, they don't really owe you anything. They don't owe you their praise or their peace of mind. But when you get it, it's like, way to go. That's not to put down that I don't mind getting compliments from close people and loved ones. That's great as well. But those other moments are quite inspirational and quite uplifting.
Yeah, it's well put. It is a conundrum we all go through. It's like everybody says, "Oh, that was great, that was great, that was great." I said, "No, I want some real feedback." Like one of my favorites is under one of my Mike Kelly interviews online. It goes, "The interviewer was problematic," and I'm like, "Yes, finally." So the first question is, what's the best thing for a human being? And Wilhelm Reich said the best thing for a human being is another human being. And the last question is, what gives you the most optimism? This is what they asked Groucho Marx at the end of his life. And he said, other people. So it's sure been fun spending this time with another person, especially because it's you, Alex. Thank you so much. It's really been enlightening.
Yeah, thank you so much. It's I always look forward to hearing from you and talking to you, man. This is awesome.
Yeah, and we'll continue talking forever and ever. I hope. I'm going to hit the end broadcast button, but we'll be in touch, and look forward to all your projects and your studies ahead. Really cool.
Awesome.
Thank you
so much.
Thanks, Alex.
You got it, brother. Take care, man.